My name is Marissa Hale, and for 6 years my family believed I was a liar. Not because they caught me doing something wrong, not because I had failed out of school, and not because I had made some catastrophic mistake that destroyed my future. They believed it because my sister told them a story. And once that story settled into their minds, it became more powerful than any truth I could offer. For 6 years, my father never called on my birthday. My mother never answered a single email, and neither of them showed up for the moments I had worked half my life to achieve. They missed my graduation. They missed the ceremony where I completed one of the most competitive neurosurgery fellowships in the country, and they missed every milestone that followed because somewhere along the way they stopped seeing me as their daughter and started seeing me as a disappointment. The strange thing is that families rarely fall apart all at once. Most of the time they break the way old houses collapse. The damage begins years before anyone notices. Tiny cracks appear in the foundation. Small pieces weaken. Everyone ignores them because the structure is still standing. Then one day a storm arrives and suddenly the whole thing comes down. Looking back now, I know the storm wasn't my sister's lie. The lie was simply the final push. The cracks had been there my entire life. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, in a modest 2-story house where there were technically 2 daughters but only one who ever seemed to matter. My sister Vanessa was 3 years older than me, and from the day she learned how to speak, she understood something about people that I never did. She knew how to make them feel important. She remembered birthdays. She laughed at the right moments. She could walk into a room full of strangers and leave 30 minutes later with everyone convinced she was remarkable. My parents adored that about her. My father, Robert, would sit at the dinner table listening to her stories after school as though she were delivering breaking news from another planet. My mother, Elaine, would smile at everything Vanessa said, even when it wasn't particularly funny. Meanwhile, I was the quiet kid who spent lunch periods in the library reading books that most people my age had no interest in. I wasn't unhappy. I genuinely loved learning. Science fascinated me. The human brain fascinated me even more. While other kids talked about celebrities and football games, I was reading articles about neurological disorders and surgical breakthroughs. Unfortunately, those topics didn't earn much attention in my house. At 10 years old, I won a statewide academic competition and brought home a trophy almost as tall as I was. My parents congratulated me for about 30 seconds before leaving early because Vanessa had a theater rehearsal they couldn't miss. At 13, I was accepted into a gifted science program at Ohio State University. My father forgot the presentation date entirely. At 16, I graduated near the top of my class and received a scholarship that covered most of my undergraduate expenses. My mother proudly shared the news with relatives, but somehow the conversation still turned into a discussion about Vanessa's latest promotion at work. That was the pattern. Vanessa existed and everyone celebrated. I achieved and everyone acknowledged it briefly before returning their attention to her. For years I told myself it didn't matter. I convinced myself I was stronger than that. But every child wants to be seen by their parents, and every child notices when they aren't. Everything changed when I was accepted into one of the country's most prestigious neurosurgery fellowship programs. I was 24 years old when the acceptance email arrived. I remember staring at the screen for nearly 5 minutes because I couldn't believe it was real. The program accepted only a handful of candidates every year, and doctors across the country competed fiercely for those positions. I called my parents immediately. For the first time in my life, my father sounded genuinely impressed. Not polite, not supportive, impressed. I can still hear his voice. "That's one hell of an achievement, Marissa." It was such a simple sentence, but I had spent years waiting to hear something like that. My mother cried when she told relatives the news. Neighbors called to congratulate me. For a brief moment I felt like I finally existed in my own family. I finally mattered. Looking back now, that moment was probably the beginning of everything, because while my parents were celebrating me, Vanessa was sitting quietly across the dinner table watching the spotlight move somewhere she wasn't used to seeing it. At the time, I didn't notice anything unusual. She smiled. She hugged me. She asked questions about the fellowship. Lots of questions. She wanted to know who my supervisors would be, which hospital I would work at, what my schedule looked like, what kind of research I planned to pursue. I thought she was interested because she was proud of me. Instead, I was handing her every piece of information she would later use against me. The fellowship brought me to Seattle, and for the first time in my life I felt completely free. Nobody there knew me as Vanessa's younger sister. Nobody compared us. Nobody expected me to stay quiet while someone else occupied the center of attention. I was simply Dr. Marissa Hale, a young physician pursuing the career she had dreamed about since childhood. The work was brutal. Some weeks felt like a blur of hospital hallways, operating rooms, and half-finished meals eaten at 2 in the morning. But I loved every second of it. I was exactly where I wanted to be. Then, during my second year, something unexpected happened. My mentor, Dr. Leonard Graves, suffered a devastating stroke. He wasn't just a supervisor. He was one of the most respected neurosurgeons in the country and the man largely responsible for guiding my career. Overnight, he went from saving lives to fighting for his own. His research program was suddenly at risk of collapsing, and the hospital asked several of us to help preserve years of work while he recovered. After discussions with the fellowship board, a temporary modification was approved that allowed me to split my responsibilities between clinical training and the research transition. Everything was official, everything was documented, every signature required was obtained. There was nothing controversial about it. It was simply a temporary adjustment. The problem was that I called Vanessa and explained it to her. Even now, I don't fully understand why I trusted her. Maybe because she was my sister. Maybe because part of me still believed we were finally becoming close. I explained everything. The modified schedule, the paperwork, the timeline, the expected return to normal training. Vanessa listened carefully and sounded supportive. She even told me not to worry if Mom and Dad had questions because she could explain it to them. I remember feeling relieved after that conversation. 3 days later, my phone rang just after midnight while I was reviewing patient charts at the hospital. The caller ID displayed my father's name. I answered immediately. The moment I heard his voice, I knew something was wrong. There was no warmth, no concern, no curiosity, just disappointment. Heavy, cold disappointment. "Is it true?" he asked. I frowned and asked what he meant. There was a long pause before he finally spoke again. "Vanessa told us everything." My stomach dropped. I asked him what exactly she had said. Another pause. Then came the sentence that changed my life. "She said you've been removed from the fellowship, and that you've been lying to us for months." I stood up so fast my chair slammed into the wall behind me. I told him that wasn't true. I tried explaining the situation. I tried describing the approved schedule change. I tried reminding him that all the paperwork existed. But every word seemed to make things worse. Finally, my mother took the phone. She was crying. Real tears. The kind that come from heartbreak. "How could you do this to us, Marissa?" she whispered. In that moment, I realized something terrifying. They weren't asking questions because they had already decided the answers. Somewhere between my explanation and Vanessa's story, they had chosen who they believed, and for the first time in my life I understood what it felt like to watch the ground disappear beneath your feet. What I didn't know then was that the next 5 days would cost me my entire family, and the person responsible for it all was the sister I had trusted more than anyone. The next morning I called my father before sunrise. I barely slept after that conversation. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the disappointment in his voice, and the tears in my mother's. I kept replaying every sentence, trying to figure out where things had gone wrong, trying to understand how a temporary fellowship modification had somehow become a story about failure and deception. By 6 in the morning, I was sitting alone in the hospital cafeteria with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. I dialed my father's number again. It rang twice before going to voicemail. I waited an hour and called again. Voicemail. Around lunchtime, I called my mother. The call connected, but the moment she heard my voice, she hung up. I stared at the screen for several seconds before trying again. This time it went directly to voicemail. That was the first day. By the second day, I stopped worrying about the misunderstanding and started worrying about something much worse. My parents weren't confused. They were avoiding me. Those are two very different things. Confused people ask questions. Confused people want answers. My parents seemed determined not to hear any answers at all. I sent emails explaining everything in detail. I attached official documentation from the fellowship board. I included copies of approval forms, schedules, and letters from hospital administration. I even provided contact information for supervisors who could verify every word. The first email was short and calm. The second was longer because I thought maybe I hadn't explained clearly enough. The third was written at 2 in the morning after finishing a 14-hour shift, and I remember reading it 6 times before pressing send because I was terrified of sounding emotional. I wanted facts. Just facts. Facts were supposed to matter. At least that's what I believed at the time. The problem was that facts only matter when people are willing to look at them. On the third day, I called Vanessa. She answered immediately. Her voice sounded concerned, almost gentle. Looking back, That was probably the most disturbing part. She never sounded nervous. She never sounded guilty. She sounded exactly like someone comforting a family member through a difficult situation. I asked her what she had told Mom and Dad. There was a brief silence before she sighed. "Marissa, they're really upset right now." I remember gripping the phone harder. "That isn't what I asked." Another pause. "I told them what I thought was happening." I could feel anger beginning to rise in my chest. "What you thought was happening? Vanessa, there are documents. There are signatures. There are official approvals." She lowered her voice as though she were trying to calm a child. "Maybe that's what you've convinced yourself." I actually laughed because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Convinced myself? What are you talking about?" She hesitated just long enough to sound sincere. "I'm worried about you, Marissa. You've been under a lot of stress. Maybe you're not seeing things clearly." That was the moment something shifted inside me. Until then, I had believed there was still a misunderstanding somewhere. I thought, but as I listened to Vanessa speak, I realized she wasn't confused. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was creating a version of reality where any evidence that contradicted her story automatically became proof that I was unstable. It was a perfect trap. Every attempt I made to defend myself became another reason not to trust me. By the fourth day, I was exhausted. Not physically. Emotional exhaustion is different. Physical exhaustion can be fixed with sleep. Emotional exhaustion feels like carrying a weight that keeps getting heavier no matter how hard you try to put it down. I worked my shifts, attended meetings, completed rounds, and somehow continued functioning while my personal life collapsed around me. One afternoon, I received a call from my friend Daniel Brooks. At the time, he was just a legal aid attorney, volunteering at a community health clinic attached to the hospital. Years later, he would become my husband. But back then, he was simply one of the few people who seemed capable of listening without immediately trying to solve the problem. He asked me if I wanted dinner after work. I almost said no because I didn't feel like talking to anyone. Then I realized I hadn't eaten properly in 2 days. We met at a small diner near the waterfront. I told him everything. The fellowship, the phone calls, the emails, Vanessa's accusations. My parents' silence. He listened without interrupting. When I finally finished speaking, he sat quietly for a moment before asking one question. "If a patient brought you this story, what would you tell them?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" He leaned back in his chair. "Imagine someone came into your office and said they had evidence, documentation, witnesses, and proof, but nobody would even look at it because a family member convinced everyone they were lying. Would you tell that person to keep blaming themselves?" I stared at him. "No." He nodded. "Then stop doing it to yourself." It was such a simple statement. But it stayed with me long after dinner ended. The 5th day was when everything finally broke. I checked my email during a break between cases and noticed that none of my messages had been opened. Not one. Most email systems allow you to see delivery confirmations. All of mine showed delivered. None showed opened. I sat in an empty conference room staring at the screen for nearly 10 minutes. Then I printed everything. Every approval letter, every fellowship document, every email. I assembled a package nearly an inch thick and mailed it overnight to my parents' house in Columbus. I paid extra for signature confirmation because I wanted proof they received it. 2 days later, the package was returned unopened. I still remember holding the box in my apartment. My name was written in the return section. My parents' address was covered by a bright sticker that read, "Return to sender." There was something strangely final about it. Emails can be ignored. Phone calls can be missed. But returning a package unopened requires a decision. Someone has to physically reject it. Someone has to look at your name and choose not to know what you have to say. That night I called my Aunt Catherine, my mother's younger sister. She had always been kind to me and was one of the few relatives who treated Vanessa and me equally. I explained the situation and asked if she could talk to my parents. She promised she would try. The next evening she called me back. I knew from the sound of her voice before she said a single word that it hadn't gone well. She told me my father refused to discuss it. He insisted Vanessa had already shown him enough evidence. He claimed I was manipulating people to protect myself. When Catherine attempted to mention the fellowship documents, he ended the conversation. I thanked her for trying and hung up. Then I sat alone in my apartment for a very long time. There are moments in life when something inside you quietly dies. Not dramatically, not all at once, just a small part of you that finally accepts a truth you didn't want to believe. That night I stopped expecting my parents to call. I stopped checking my phone every 10 minutes. I stopped imagining that an apology was coming. For 5 days I had fought desperately to save the relationship. For 5 days I had convinced myself that the next email, the next phone call, the next piece of evidence would fix everything. Suddenly I understood that evidence wasn't the problem. The problem was that my parents had already chosen who they trusted. Vanessa hadn't simply told a lie. She had given them a version of reality that was easier to believe than the truth. The truth required admitting they had misunderstood their daughter. The lie allowed them to feel disappointed instead. One option demanded humility. The other demanded nothing at all. Human beings often choose the easier path. A week later, I received a final text message from Vanessa. It arrived just after midnight. I remember staring at the screen for nearly a minute before opening it. The message contained only one sentence. Maybe someday they'll forgive you. I read it 3 times. Then I set the phone down and walked out onto my apartment balcony overlooking the Seattle skyline. Rain was falling lightly across the city. Traffic moved below like streams of red and white light. Somewhere in Columbus, my family was sleeping peacefully, completely convinced that I had destroyed my own future. Somewhere my parents believed they no longer knew their daughter, and somewhere Vanessa was probably congratulating herself because the spotlight had finally returned to where she wanted it. Standing there in the cold rain, I made a decision. If my family refused to see who I really was, then I would become someone so successful that one day the truth would be impossible to ignore. I didn't know how long it would take. I didn't know what it would cost. I only knew one thing. The next chapter of my life would be built without them. What I couldn't possibly know was that 6 years later fate would drag every one of us back together inside a hospital, and the first person lying unconscious on my operating table would be the sister who had started it all. The strange thing about heartbreak is that eventually it becomes routine. People imagine devastating loss as something dramatic, something that consumes every waking moment forever. But that isn't how it works. At first it feels unbearable. Then little by little your mind adapts because it has no choice. You still carry the pain, but eventually you learn how to carry it while doing other things. You learn how to answer emails while your heart is broken. You learn how to eat dinner while missing people who no longer speak to you. You learn how to smile at coworkers even when part of you is grieving a family that is still alive. The weeks after losing my parents were some of the hardest of my life. But they were also the beginning of something I didn't recognize at the time. They were the beginning of freedom. Not the kind of freedom people celebrate, not excitement or adventure. A quieter kind. The freedom that comes when you stop spending all your energy trying to earn love from people who have already decided not to give it. Once I stopped waiting for my phone to ring, I suddenly had all that energy left over. And I poured every bit of it into becoming the surgeon I wanted to be. The next 2 years passed in a blur of operating rooms, research conferences, overnight shifts, and endless hours studying cases that most people would consider impossible. Neurosurgery demands obsession. There really isn't another way to describe it. The human brain doesn't tolerate shortcuts, and neither do the people who operate on it. While other physicians finished their shifts and went home, I often stayed behind reviewing scans and surgical footage. I became known for being relentless. Residents joked that I practically lived inside the hospital. The truth wasn't far from reality. Work became my refuge. Inside the operating room, life made sense. A patient either had a problem or they didn't. A treatment either worked or it didn't. There was evidence. There were facts. There was logic. Unlike my family, medicine never asked me to compete with someone's version of reality. Medicine cared only about what was true. Looking back, I think that's one reason I loved it so much. During my 3rd year in Seattle, I received news that should have been one of the happiest moments of my life. The fellowship board selected me for a highly competitive leadership track designed to prepare future department chiefs. Less than 5% of candidates were accepted. My supervisor shook my hand and told me I had one of the brightest futures he'd ever seen. My colleagues took me out for drinks that evening. Everyone was celebrating except me. Not because I wasn't proud, but because the first thought that entered my mind was that my parents would never know. For a few seconds, I actually considered calling them. Then I remembered the unopened package sitting in a drawer at my apartment and realized how foolish that would be. That was the thing nobody tells you about estrangement. The big moments aren't always the hardest. Sometimes it's the small reflexes that hurt most. Reaching for your phone before remembering there's nobody on the other end. Hearing good news and instinctively wanting to tell someone who stopped listening years ago. Around that same time, Daniel became one of the most important people in my life. We had remained friends after that first dinner, and over the years, our friendship slowly evolved into something deeper. He was patient in a way I wasn't used to. Most people hear a painful story and immediately try to fix it. Daniel never did that. He listened, he asked questions, he paid attention. One rainy evening after a 14-hour shift, we were walking along the waterfront when he asked me something nobody had ever asked before. "Who are you trying to prove yourself to?" I laughed and told him I wasn't trying to prove anything. He smiled because he knew I was lying. "Marissa, you're one of the smartest people I've ever met. But sometimes you work like someone is keeping score." His words followed me for weeks. Eventually I realized he was right. Somewhere deep inside, part of me still believed that if I became successful enough, accomplished enough, impressive enough, my parents would eventually regret their decision. I hated admitting it, but it was true. Success had become my language of survival. A year later, Daniel proposed during a weekend trip to the Oregon coast. It wasn't elaborate. No photographers. No crowd. Just the two of us standing near the water while waves crashed against the rocks below. When he asked me to marry him, I said yes before he even finished the sentence. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by loss. We married 10 months later in a small ceremony overlooking Puget Sound. 50 guests attended. Friends, colleagues, mentors, and people who had become family through choice rather than blood. 2 invitations were mailed to Columbus. One addressed to my parents, one addressed to Vanessa. Neither received a response. I wasn't surprised. That was probably the saddest part. The absence didn't hurt anymore because I expected it. Expectations are where most pain lives. Once they're gone, disappointment becomes routine. Life continued moving forward. Daniel's legal career flourished. Mine did too. I completed the leadership program and accepted a position at one of the largest trauma centers on the West Coast. By the time I turned 30, I had achieved more professionally than I ever thought possible. Colleagues sought my opinion on complex cases. Residents requested placements on my surgical team. Invitations to speak at medical conferences began arriving regularly. From the outside, everything looked perfect. But there was still a small part of me that wondered what story Vanessa was telling now. Occasionally, relatives I barely knew would appear on social media and then disappear again. Once I received a strange message from a cousin asking if I was doing better. When I asked what he meant, he never replied. Another time, a distant aunt sent a message saying she hoped I found peace. It felt as though people were talking about me without actually talking to me. I suspected Vanessa had continued building her version of events long after my parents stopped speaking to me. At the time, I chose not to investigate. I told myself it didn't matter. In reality, I was afraid of what I might discover. Everything changed one afternoon when my Aunt Catherine called unexpectedly. We hadn't spoken in several months. Her voice sounded cautious, almost nervous. After a few minutes of small talk, she asked if I had time to discuss something important. I told her I did. There was a long pause before she finally spoke. "Marissa, I think you need to know what's been happening back here." I felt a familiar knot tighten in my stomach. She proceeded to tell me things I never could have imagined. According to relatives, Vanessa had spent years repeating variations of the same story. Sometimes she claimed I had suffered a professional breakdown. Sometimes she implied I had been dismissed from medical training. Other times she suggested I refused contact because I was ashamed of what had happened. Each version was slightly different, but the message remained the same. I had failed. I had disappeared. I had abandoned my family. What shocked me most wasn't the lie itself, it was the scale. Vanessa hadn't told one lie. She had maintained an entire narrative for years. Every holiday, every family gathering, every conversation where my name surfaced. She had become the official historian of my absence. After the call ended, I sat alone in my office for nearly an hour. Outside my window, Seattle traffic moved through the evening rain. Inside, memories I thought I had buried began resurfacing. The unanswered calls, the returned package, the final text message. Suddenly, everything looked different. Vanessa hadn't simply protected one lie. She had spent years reinforcing it. The realization should have made me angry, but mostly it made me tired. I was exhausted by the thought of being discussed by people who never bothered to call me. Eventually, I closed the blinds, packed my things, and went home. Daniel listened quietly while I told him everything. When I finished, he set down his coffee and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "That's not normal sibling jealousy, Marissa." I frowned. "What is it then?" He thought for a moment before answering. "Honestly, it sounds like she's afraid of who you became." I wanted to dismiss the idea, But part of me wondered if he was right. Maybe Vanessa had never been trying to convince people I failed. Maybe she was trying to convince herself. Over the next several months, life settled back into its usual rhythm. Surgeries, meetings, research, family gatherings with friends who had become my real support system. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. It wasn't intuition exactly. More like the sense that a story unfinished for years was somehow approaching its final chapter. Then one evening, almost 6 years after I lost my family, Aunt Catherine called again. This time she sounded frightened. She told me there was something about Vanessa I needed to hear immediately. Something serious. Something that explained more than I realized. Before she could finish, my hospital pager suddenly activated. A level 1 emergency trauma alert had just arrived. I apologized, told her I would call back as soon as possible, and hurried toward the emergency department. What I didn't know was that the information Catherine was trying to tell me was already racing toward my hospital at 70 miles per hour inside a vehicle that was about to change every one of our lives forever. Within a few hours, someone from my past would be lying unconscious inside my operating room, and the first person I would see when the doors opened would be the last person I ever expected to face again. The pager went off at 11:43 p.m. on a Thursday night, and at first I treated it like every other emergency alert I had received over the years. When you work in trauma medicine long enough, your body develops a strange relationship with crisis. The adrenaline arrives before the conscious thought does. By the time most people would still be reading the message, I was already moving. I left my office, pulled on my white coat, and headed toward the emergency department while mentally reviewing the information displayed on the pager screen. Female patient. Severe motor vehicle collision. Possible traumatic brain injury. Significant blood loss. Unstable vital signs. Estimated arrival in 6 minutes. It was serious, but unfortunately serious wasn't unusual. Trauma centers live in a permanent state of controlled chaos. Somewhere in the city, a family was about to receive the worst phone call of their lives. Somewhere an ambulance crew was fighting to keep a stranger alive. Somewhere a surgeon was needed. Tonight that surgeon happened to be me. I pushed through the emergency department doors and immediately felt the familiar energy of a major trauma activation. Nurses were preparing equipment. Residents were gathering at stations. Respiratory therapists were setting up airways. The atmosphere carried that unique combination of urgency and discipline that only exists inside hospitals. Nobody panics. Panic wastes time. Everyone simply moves faster. I approached the trauma desk and picked up the preliminary intake report. My eyes scanned the information automatically until they landed on the patient's name, Marissa Hale. For a moment, the world became strangely quiet. I wish I could tell you that years of medical training prepared me for something like that, but they didn't. Nothing prepares you for seeing the name of a person who destroyed your life appear on an emergency chart at the exact moment they are fighting to survive. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Not because I didn't understand what I was reading, but because part of my brain refused to process it. Marissa Hale, female, 36 years old, severe head trauma, emergency contact Robert Hale, father. The letters seemed unreal. Around me, people continued moving. Monitors beeped. Intercom announcements echoed through the hallway. Somewhere, a resident was discussing blood products with a nurse. The hospital kept functioning while my entire past suddenly collided with my present. One of the charge nurses noticed my expression and asked if everything was okay. I took a breath, handed the report back, and nodded. "Family member," I said. Her eyes widened immediately. Hospital policy was very clear about situations involving relatives. Potential conflicts of interest had to be disclosed. Alternative physicians needed to be available. Everything had to be documented. Within 30 seconds, I had already notified administration and requested a second attending surgeon as backup. The process was automatic. Years of training taking over while my emotions struggled to catch up. The ambulance arrived 4 minutes later. The doors burst open and the paramedics came rushing inside. Blood covered parts of the stretcher. One medic was squeezing a ventilation bag. Another was shouting vital signs. Trauma patients rarely look the way movies portray them. Real emergencies are less dramatic and somehow more disturbing. Vanessa looked smaller than I remembered. Pale, unconscious. Her dark hair matted with blood. Bruising already spreading across one side of her face. The paramedic gave a rapid report while we transferred her onto the trauma bed. High-speed collision. Driver side impact. Possible intracranial bleeding, decreasing responsiveness, blood pressure falling, oxygen levels unstable. I forced myself to focus, not on the sister who had lied about me for 6 years, not on the family I lost, just on the patient. That's what medicine requires. A surgeon doesn't operate on history. A surgeon operates on anatomy. CT imaging confirmed what we feared within minutes. Massive intracranial hemorrhage, significant swelling, multiple fractures. Without immediate intervention, she would die. While the trauma team prepared the operating room, another nurse approached quietly and informed me that the patient's family had arrived. I didn't need to ask who that meant. 6 years had passed since I last saw my parents. 6 years since unanswered calls, unopened letters, and returned packages. 6 years since they decided Vanessa's version of reality mattered more than mine. And now they were here, somewhere inside the same building. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger exactly. More like the sudden awareness of an old scar. You stop noticing it most days, but certain moments remind you it's still there. I considered asking another surgeon to take over. The thought crossed my mind for perhaps 3 seconds. Then I looked through the glass at Vanessa. Whatever she had done, whatever damage she had caused, she was still a human being bleeding into her own brain. And regardless of what my family thought about me, I was still a doctor. The oath mattered. The patient mattered. Everything else could wait. I scrubbed in and prepared for surgery. The operation lasted nearly 4 hours. Trauma neurosurgery requires intense concentration because mistakes are unforgiving. Millimeters matter, seconds matter. Every decision carries consequences. For those 4 hours, my family disappeared entirely. There was only the procedure, the bleeding vessel, the swelling, the damaged tissue, the monitors tracking every fragile improvement. My team worked flawlessly. Residents anticipated instructions before I gave them. Nurses moved with practiced precision. Little by little, we regained control. The bleeding slowed, pressure stabilized, brain activity improved. At 3:52 a.m., I completed the final stage of the procedure and stepped back from the table. Vanessa was alive. The outcome was far from guaranteed, but she was alive. One of the attending surgeons assisting me glanced over and quietly said, "That may have saved her life." I removed my gloves and looked through the observation window into the hallway beyond. Somewhere beyond those walls, my parents were waiting. I didn't go immediately. First, I reviewed the post-operative plan. Then I documented the procedure. Then I stood alone in a scrub room for nearly 2 minutes staring at my reflection in a stainless steel cabinet. I looked older than the last time my parents had seen me. More confident, more tired, stronger in some ways, sadder in others. The hospital badge clipped to my coat identified me as Dr. Marissa Hale, Chief of Neurosurgical Trauma Services. 6 years earlier, my parents believed I had failed out of medicine. Tonight, I had just completed one of the most difficult surgeries of my career. The irony was almost unbearable. Finally, I took a breath and walked toward the surgical waiting area. I saw them before they saw me. My mother looked older, much older. Grief and worry had carved lines into her face that hadn't existed when I left Ohio. My father sat rigidly in a chair staring at the floor. For a moment, neither of them noticed me. Then my mother looked up. The recognition happened instantly. Her eyes widened. Her entire body froze. My father followed her gaze and slowly stood. Nobody spoke. The silence stretched between us like a physical thing. 6 years of absence. 6 years of unanswered questions. 6 years of lies. Finally, I broke the silence because someone had to. The surgery was successful. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. She survived the procedure and she's currently stable. Neither of them responded immediately. They simply stared. My mother looked from my face to the identification badge hanging from my coat and then back again. I watched the realization spread across her expression. Not just recognition. Understanding. The kind that arrives when a belief you've held for years suddenly collides with undeniable evidence. My father's eyes dropped to the title printed beneath my name, Chief of Neurosurgical Trauma Services. He read it twice. Then a third time. His lips parted slightly as though he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, my mother whispered my name, Marissa. Hearing her say it after 6 years felt stranger than I expected. Not comforting, not painful, just strange. Like hearing a song from childhood that you haven't thought about in years. She took a hesitant step forward. You're a surgeon? The question almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny. Because it was unbelievable. I had spent 6 years becoming exactly what I always said I would become. The only reason she didn't know was because she never listened. "Yes," I replied quietly. "I am." "My father's face had gone completely pale," Vanessa said. He stopped. I looked directly at him. I know what Vanessa said. The words hung in the air. Nobody moved. Nobody knew what came next. Behind me, nurses and physicians moved through the hallway, occasionally glancing toward us as they sensed the tension. My mother looked as though she might cry. My father looked as though he had just realized the ground beneath him wasn't solid after all. And standing there in the middle of that hospital corridor, I understood something. The surgery wasn't the real collision. The real collision was happening now. 6 years of lies had finally crashed into reality, and reality had arrived wearing a white coat. What neither of them knew was that by morning the truth would begin unraveling completely, and the first person responsible for exposing it would not be me. It would be someone who had been quietly collecting evidence for years, waiting for the moment when nobody could ignore it anymore. I left the waiting room shortly after that conversation because I honestly didn't know what else there was to say. For 6 years I had imagined dozens of possible reunions with my parents. In some versions, they apologized. In others, they denied everything. Sometimes they cried. Sometimes they blamed me. But none of those imagined conversations had taken place under fluorescent hospital lights at 4 o'clock in the morning while their favorite daughter was recovering from emergency brain surgery I had just performed. Reality has a way of ignoring the scripts we create in our heads. By the time I reached the ICU, exhaustion was beginning to settle into my bones. The adrenaline that had carried me through the operation was fading, leaving behind the weight of everything that had happened. I reviewed Vanessa's chart, spoke with the overnight team, and completed the final documentation before stepping into my office. For the first time all night, I was alone. I sat in silence, staring at the city lights outside the window. Somewhere below, Seattle continued moving as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Cars crossed intersections, restaurants closed, people slept peacefully in their homes. Meanwhile, 6 years of lies had begun collapsing inside a hospital less than 300 yards away. I was still sitting there when my phone rang. The caller ID displayed Aunt Catherine. For a moment I simply stared at the screen because I already knew why she was calling. Earlier that evening, she had tried to warn me about something involving Vanessa before the trauma alert interrupted us. I answered immediately. Catherine didn't waste time with greetings. "Marissa, are you alone?" she asked. Her voice sounded unusually serious. I told her I was. There was a brief pause before she exhaled heavily. "Good. Because what I'm about to tell you is something I've been sitting on for years." I felt my stomach tighten. Over the next 20 minutes, she explained things I wasn't prepared to hear. After my parents cut me off, Vanessa didn't simply allow them to believe the lie. She actively protected it. Every time a relative questioned the story, Vanessa supplied another explanation. Every time someone heard a rumor that contradicted her version of events, she dismissed it. When relatives mentioned seeing professional updates about me online, she claimed those achievements were exaggerated. When family members suggested reaching out to me directly, she always had a reason why it was a bad idea. According to Catherine, Vanessa spent years maintaining the deception with almost obsessive dedication. At first I thought she was just embarrassed, Catherine admitted. Then I realized she was terrified. I asked what she meant. Catherine sighed. She was terrified someone would discover the truth. The most shocking revelation came next. About 3 years earlier, Catherine had accidentally received an email intended for my mother. Attached to it was a copy of an article featuring me and several colleagues discussing advancements in neurosurgical trauma care. The article clearly identified me as a surgeon. Catherine assumed my parents would be thrilled. Instead, the email mysteriously disappeared from family discussions entirely. A few months later, she learned why. Vanessa had intercepted it. She convinced my parents the article was misleading and claimed I wasn't actually practicing medicine. According to Vanessa, I was merely assisting researchers and exaggerating my credentials. The explanation sounded absurd now, but at the time my parents accepted it because it aligned with what they already believed. Confirmation bias is powerful. People rarely question information that supports the conclusions they've already reached. By the time Catherine finished speaking, I felt physically sick. Not because Vanessa lied. I already knew she lied. What disturbed me was the scale of it. The planning, the maintenance, the years spent reinforcing a false reality. This wasn't a single impulsive act of jealousy. This was something far more deliberate. Later that morning, around 9 o'clock, I returned to the ICU to check on Vanessa's condition. She remained sedated, but stable. Her vital signs were improving, and the latest scans looked encouraging. From a medical perspective, everything was progressing as well as we could hope. Emotionally, however, the atmosphere surrounding her room felt like a pressure cooker. My parents were still there. They looked as though neither had slept. My mother stood when she saw me enter the hallway. There was a vulnerability in her expression that I had never seen before. Growing up, she always seemed certain of herself, certain of her decisions, certain of her judgments. Now she looked lost. "Marissa," she said quietly. I stopped a few feet away. Neither of us seemed sure how close we were supposed to stand. The distance between us felt symbolic somehow. My father remained seated, staring at the floor. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then my mother asked the question I knew was coming. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" The words hung in the air. I actually laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Tell you what," she blinked. "That you became a surgeon." I stared at her in disbelief. I tried. The silence that followed was devastating. I called 14 times during the first week. I sent emails. I mailed documents. I sent proof. You returned everything unopened. My father's shoulders visibly tensed. My mother looked down. "We thought," she began, then stopped. "You thought Vanessa was telling the truth," I finished for her. Neither of them argued. A little after noon, the situation changed completely. Catherine arrived at the hospital carrying a folder. Not a purse, not a bag, a folder. The moment I saw it, I knew exactly what it contained. Evidence. Years of evidence. She walked directly into the family consultation room and requested that all of us join her. Vanessa was still unconscious, so she couldn't participate. That left me, my parents, and Catherine sitting around a small conference table that suddenly felt much too small. Catherine placed the folder in front of her and opened it carefully. Then she began removing documents one by one. Printed emails, fellowship records, copies of correspondence, screenshots of messages, letters, timelines. Every piece of evidence I had ever attempted to send my parents seemed to be sitting inside that folder. Catherine had spent years saving everything. "I didn't know when this day would come," she said quietly, "but I knew it eventually would." My father looked confused. My mother looked terrified. Catherine slid the first document across the table. It was one of my original fellowship approval forms. Then came copies of my unanswered emails. Then photographs from professional conferences. Then an article identifying me as a department leader. Then another. Then another. Piece by piece, the story Vanessa created began falling apart. The hardest moment came when Catherine produced copies of messages Vanessa had sent her privately over the years. I watched my mother's hands begin trembling as Catherine read them aloud. In one message, Vanessa specifically instructed Catherine not to discuss my medical career with my parents because it would only create confusion. In another, she claimed I was intentionally misleading people about my professional accomplishments. In a third, she admitted she worried my parents might try reconnecting if they learned the truth. Nobody spoke while the messages were read. Nobody interrupted. There was nothing left to say. The evidence spoke for itself. My father's face became paler with every page. My mother eventually covered her mouth with both hands. For years they had trusted Vanessa without question. For years they had dismissed every attempt I made to defend myself. Now the reality sat in front of them printed in black and white. At some point, my father stood up and walked to the window. I had never seen him look small before. Growing up, he always seemed larger than life. Even when he was wrong, he carried himself with certainty. That certainty was gone now. He stood silently staring at the parking lot below. Finally, he spoke. "She lied to us." Nobody answered because the statement didn't require confirmation. A few seconds later, he asked another question. "How long?" Catherine looked down at the documents before responding. "From what I can tell, almost from the beginning." The room went completely silent. I watched my father's shoulders sag. It was as though 6 years of certainty suddenly vanished and left him struggling to support the weight of what remained. My mother started crying quietly. Not dramatic sobs. Just the exhausted tears of someone realizing that a mistake they desperately want to undo cannot be undone. That afternoon, Vanessa finally regained consciousness. I wasn't present when my parents first spoke with her, but I learned later that the conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. Apparently, my father asked one question. Only one. Why? According to a nurse who overheard part of the exchange, Vanessa began crying immediately. Whether the tears were genuine or strategic, nobody knew. For the first time in years, however, nobody seemed interested in her explanation. The evidence had already spoken. The damage had already been measured. And perhaps most importantly, the daughter she spent years portraying as a failure had just saved her life. There are moments when reality becomes impossible to argue with. This was one of them. Later that evening, I received a message from Catherine. It contained only a single sentence. "They're finally seeing the truth." I stared at those words for a long time. 6 years earlier, I would have celebrated them. 6 years earlier, they were all I wanted. Now I wasn't sure how I felt. Because seeing the truth and repairing the damage are not the same thing. One happens in a moment. The other can take years. And standing in the hallway outside Vanessa's room, watching my parents through the glass, I realized the hardest part of this story was only beginning. Because sooner or later they were going to ask for something I wasn't sure I could give them, another chance. The first thing I learned about forgiveness is that it doesn't arrive the moment the truth comes out. Movies love that version of the story. The apology happens, the tears fall, everyone hugs, and years of damage magically disappear. Real life isn't like that. Real life is messier. Real life leaves scars. The truth may expose a wound, but exposure isn't the same thing as healing. 3 weeks passed after Vanessa's surgery before I agreed to meet my parents outside the hospital. During those 3 weeks I focused on work, on Daniel, and on maintaining the life I had spent 6 years building. My parents called several times. Sometimes I answered, sometimes I didn't. Not because I wanted revenge, but because for the first time in my life I understood something important. Access is a privilege. Relationships require effort. Love requires consistency. For 6 years I had been the only person fighting to keep our family connected. I wasn't interested in carrying that responsibility alone anymore. If my parents wanted a relationship, they would have to prove it. Not with words, with actions. The meeting took place at a small cafe overlooking Elliott Bay. Daniel offered to come with me, but I asked him to wait nearby instead. I needed to have this conversation myself. When I arrived, my parents were already there. They stood when they saw me. For a moment I was struck by how much older they looked. Not physically, although age had certainly changed them. It was something deeper. Regret ages people differently. It settles into the face. It changes the way they carry themselves. My father no longer looked like the man who always had answers. My mother no longer looked like the woman who believed everything would somehow work itself out. They looked like two people trying to understand how they had lost 6 years of their daughter's life. We sat down. Nobody spoke immediately. Finally, my father broke the silence. "I don't know how to start this." I nodded. "Then start with the truth." He stared at his coffee for several seconds before speaking. "The truth is that I failed you." Hearing those words from my father felt surreal. This was a man who almost never admitted mistakes. Growing up, he treated certainty like a virtue. Now he sounded exhausted. "I trusted the wrong person," he continued. "And when evidence appeared that contradicted what I believed, I ignored it because admitting I was wrong felt harder than continuing to believe the lie." My mother reached across the table and took my hand. Tears filled her eyes instantly. "I'm so sorry, Marissa." There it was. The apology I had imagined hearing for years. The apology I thought would make everything better. Strangely, it didn't. Because apologies don't restore time. They don't bring back missed graduations, missed birthdays, missed celebrations, or missed years. They simply acknowledge the loss. For the next hour we talked honestly for the first time in a very long time. I told them about the nights I spent studying until sunrise, the surgeries, the conferences, my wedding, the promotions, the victories they never witnessed. My mother cried several times. My father remained mostly quiet. Occasionally he asked questions. Small questions. Careful questions. The kind people ask when they're afraid they no longer know someone. At one point he looked at me and said something that stayed with me. "You became exactly who you always said you would become." I smiled sadly. I know. The tragedy wasn't that I surprised them. The tragedy was that I didn't. Meanwhile, Vanessa's recovery continued. Physically, she improved quickly. Emotionally, things were far more complicated. Once she realized the truth had finally collapsed around her, there was nowhere left to hide. Every relative knew. Every family member knew. Every excuse she had spent years constructing had disappeared. About a month after leaving the hospital, she asked to meet me. Part of me wanted to refuse. Another part knew the conversation needed to happen. We met in a quiet restaurant on a rainy Tuesday evening. Vanessa looked different. Not just because of the surgical scar hidden beneath her hair. She looked tired. Smaller somehow. like someone carrying a weight she could no longer pretend wasn't there. We sat across from each other for nearly a minute before either of us spoke. Finally, she looked up and asked the question I had been waiting years to hear. "Do you want to know why I did it?" I thought about that for a moment. Then I nodded. Vanessa stared out the window before answering. "Because I knew you were going to become everything I couldn't." There was no anger in her voice, no manipulation, just exhaustion. She admitted that when my fellowship acceptance arrived years earlier, she panicked. For the first time in her life, she felt invisible. She had spent decades being the center of attention, and suddenly she wasn't. The lie started small. One exaggeration, one misleading conversation, then another. Eventually, she became trapped inside a story she didn't know how to escape. Every year she delayed telling the truth made the truth harder to tell. None of it excused what she had done, but understanding isn't the same thing as forgiveness. Sometimes, understanding simply explains the damage. I listened quietly before responding. "You didn't just lie about me, Vanessa. You stole years from all of us." She nodded. Tears filled her eyes. "I know." For once she didn't argue, didn't defend herself, didn't try to redirect blame. She simply accepted responsibility. It was the first honest conversation we'd ever had. Before leaving, I gave her one condition: if you want any chance of rebuilding this family, you tell the truth to everyone. She agreed immediately. Within days, she sent a detailed email to every relative explaining exactly what happened. No excuses, no justifications, just the truth. The responses varied. Some family members were angry. Some were heartbroken. Others were simply disappointed. Trust, once broken, takes a very long time to rebuild. Vanessa learned that lesson the hard way. My parents started counseling shortly afterward. To their credit, they committed to it completely. Week after week they attended sessions, confronted uncomfortable truths, and examined patterns that had existed in our family long before Vanessa told her first lie. They learned how favoritism can damage children. They learned how assumptions become blind spots. Most importantly, they learned that love isn't measured by intention. It's measured by action. You can love someone deeply and still hurt them if you stop paying attention. 6 months later, something happened that felt almost symbolic. I received an award recognizing my work in trauma neurosurgery. The ceremony took place at a hotel ballroom overlooking the water. Hundreds of physicians, administrators, and medical professionals attended. Daniel sat in the front row. My closest friends were there. Several mentors attended as well. Near the back of the room sat my parents, not in special seats, not at the center of attention, just present. When my name was announced and I walked to the stage, I saw my mother crying. I saw my father standing and applauding. For a moment I thought about everything that had happened. The unanswered calls, the returned package, the 6 years of silence. Then I thought about the present, the counseling, the effort, the uncomfortable conversations, the slow rebuilding of trust. Life rarely gives us perfect endings. Sometimes all it offers is the opportunity to build something new from the pieces that remain. Today, when people ask if I forgave my family, I tell them the truth. Forgiveness wasn't a single decision, it was a process. Some days are easier than others. Some wounds heal faster than others. But I stopped waiting for the past to change. Instead, I focused on building a future. That's what saved me. Not revenge, not justice, not proving anyone wrong. Building a life so full that other people's mistakes no longer controlled it. The greatest victory wasn't becoming a surgeon. It wasn't the awards, the promotions, or the recognition. The greatest victory was becoming someone who no longer needed validation from people who once refused to see her. A few weeks ago, my parents came to dinner at my house. Daniel cooked. My mother brought dessert. My father helped set the table. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody gave speeches. Nobody cried. We simply shared a meal. At one point, I looked around the room and realized something important. The family sitting at that table wasn't the same family I grew up with. Too much had happened for that. But maybe that was okay. Maybe healing isn't about restoring what was lost. Maybe it's about creating something better with what survives. And for the first time in many years, that possibility felt real. If you've stayed with me until the end of this story, I want to thank you. And I want to leave you with one thought. Never allow someone else's opinion to become the foundation of your identity. People can misunderstand you, they can judge you, they can even believe terrible things about you. But none of that changes who you are. Keep building, keep growing, Keep becoming the person you were meant to be. Because one day the truth has a way of catching up to everyone. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need this message today. And in the comments, tell me honestly, if you were in my position, would you have opened that door again? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, take care of yourself, believe in your own worth, and never stop building the life you deserve.